Tower of God has been one of my favorite fantasy stories of all time, ever since I read it for the first time about a year ago. Good world building has always been my number one priority in experiencing high fantasy, and Tower of God does an incredible job with it. So incredible, in fact, that I often find myself thinking about the structure of their society and the philosophical implications it carries. Their entire civilization, I would say, is almost a sort of massively ambitious thought experiment into how a society with vastly different needs and values might function from top to bottom. What's interesting is that, while we may see their method of society as barbaric and awful, the conditions they're given within the tower actually leave them with little choice, and in part due to destiny itself, may be unchangeable. Before we begin, this video will contain spoilers for the entire series, so if you haven't, go read all 500-something chapters and then come back here. Tall order, I know, but trust me, you won't regret it. Without further ado, let's begin. Now, take a second to consider the concept of Shinsu. The Tale's user story, the name for Tower of God's universe, contains within the tower this substance known as Shinsu. Shinsu, which replaces air and can take unlimited forms within the tower, mainly allows for two things that are impossible in our world. It allows individuals to amass vast amounts of combat ability for themselves while otherwise unarmed, with power potentially eclipsing entire armies of normal people. The second thing it changes is that it can slow and eventually halt the aging process of people who are proficient with it, with rankers being essentially immortal. This, in effect, changes the nature of life itself in the tower. Rather than cycling through generations with people raising children to lead the future, the leaders of the tower instead focus almost entirely on themselves. They have no need for the concept of a legacy or passing down their wealth to their children because their life's plan does not factor in an inevitable death like it does for those in our world. Yes, the 10 family leaders have children, but those children are mainly seen as tools towards the goal of strengthening their own influence within the tower, rather than how we ourselves view parenting. The stronger and more influential they can become, the more immortal they become, which allows them to take their ambitions to higher and higher levels with no end in sight. Just as wealth begets wealth, power begets power, and in that sense we can view the tower as a sort of allegory for capitalism. So we've established that within the inner tower, being immortal is essentially the endgame, a goal that is actually realistically attainable for the very strong. And yet, despite immortality being a very real goal, people's lives are considered completely disposable in the tower. Rankers serve in Jihad's army and are sacrificed regularly for political ends. The naive and the desperate are taken advantage of and abused regularly, taking, for example, the employees at the altar where Jihad delivers his orders, who are thrown under the bus towards the end of Season 2 by taking the blame for losing a set of orders, thus all being sentenced to death undeservedly. Things like this are treated very flippantly and seem to be very commonplace, showing the idea that death is treated very lightly. In fact, the Slayer White literally created two kingdoms of people and then put them to war against each other so he could roam the aftermath and consume all the dead souls for power, which totaled 1 billion deaths by the end of his reign of terror. Knowing this, Bam nevertheless decided that they could temporarily put their differences aside to fight Jihad's army. Can you imagine putting your differences aside with someone like that? Yet not only are White's actions forgivable in the context of the tower, they are in fact considered justified. Nobody really seems to begrudge his actions in even close to a manner proportional to how our world would view them. Because the tower's goal is not to treat all people as born equal, or to acknowledge that nobody can control the circumstances of their upbringing, or to give everyone a fair shot at life. The goal of the tower is to create enough strong people to rival all the other strong people, and create a natural system of checks and balances through power. What is completely irrelevant is how many weaker people must be discarded to that end. In fact, there are thousands of people in the tower with godlike abilities who could destroy entire armies of normal people without breaking a sweat. Rankers who had to climb the tower through violent trials, get the best paying jobs and gain immortality, thus incentivizing everyone to learn combat skills. In a hypothetical version of the tower where everyone agreed not to use violence against each other and to value all lives equally, most people would stop amassing combat ability since it would no longer be economically viable for them. Then, all it would take is one evil person to go on a rampage for all of society to come crashing down. The only foolproof safeguard against complete genocide is their current system, where everyone simply agrees that the ends justify the means and vie for power in a mostly unrestricted system. The promise of wealth and long life is a natural incentive for people to obtain power for themselves. That way, everyone with the potential to become strong does so, and prevents anyone else from monopolizing power in the process. Yes, Jihad rules the tower and holds the most power of anyone, but there are plenty of organizations and people that can act completely outside his influence because Jihad still knows that there is a physical limit to how much control he can exert without spreading his forces too thin. Even so, this also explains why Enryu entered the Floor of Death and dropped off the thorn. It upsets the balance of Jihad's reign by introducing the possibility for him to die back into play. Enryu, as a messenger of God, was establishing the message that no power should be absolute, and thus intervenes to remove the indomitable nature of Jihad's strength. God isn't necessarily trying to topple Jihad, only to make sure that such a thing is not impossible. The important takeaway from this is that the tower exists in a kind of extremely social Darwinist state, where the weak exist only as a stepladder for the strong to be able to grow and keep each other in check. Furthermore, this system is completely normalized by almost every character in the show, including the protagonist. Here's where things get interesting. Now that we've established the paradigm of the tower, we can begin to see the story through a certain lens. There's a lot in this story that we can forgive because we like the characters. Bomb starts a battle costing hundreds if not eventually thousands of lives in order to rescue one person. Kun helps White regain his old power by basically vacuuming up the dead people from this battle. Very few characters in the series are innocent of murder, or at the very least accomplice to it. Violence is normalized by the very structure of the tower, and every character learns to be a willing participant from the time they are born. In the Tales user story, murder isn't considered inherently evil like it is for us, because it's an important function of maintaining the stability of their society as dictated by a higher power. Everybody treats mass death and destruction as simply the natural order of things. It only really bothers them when it happens to someone they know, which, in a way, is also true for you as the reader. Were you outraged when White stood at the top of the steps to the Hell Train and had the crowd beneath kill each other for his entertainment? Sure, maybe a little, but generally speaking, it was forgotten about moments later, by both readers and the characters themselves. This callous, indifferent attitude towards death is actually a testament to SIU's extremely skillful world building. Had he not done such an excellent job developing the tower's mechanisms and functions, we would be more inclined to apply our own worldview towards it, thus limiting the scope and ambition of the story being told to us. And it starts as soon as the first few chapters, where 400 participants are told to murder each other until only 200 remain. Yet the people responsible for overseeing this slaughter, namely Han Sung-yu, Lara Ro, and Evankel, actually end up being the good guys of the story, to the extent such a thing exists. It's so easy to forget that every single one of the nameless dead people could have had their own story and their own motivations, which was just casually blipped out of existence by someone who saw them as nothing. The characters must narrowly align themselves with the few people that are most important to them, because valuing all life, as Bam especially comes to learn, ends up being an obstacle that stands between them and their goals. This, I believe, is the primary reason why Rachel is so angry and resentful at the backlash she gets for her actions. She feels that she is just doing what anyone else would in her situation, and her lack of strength is the only reason she gets impugned for it. From this perspective, she is perhaps the only one who views the tower's might makes right mentality as being inherently immoral. People with strong willpower and resolve can be discarded as trash simply for not having the power to back it up, and most of the characters take this fact in stride, whereas Rachel seeks to reject it and defy her destiny despite her weakness. This puts her at odds with everyone else, even though her actions are no more harmful than anyone else's in the bigger picture. Of course, that doesn't make her a good person, since she has done plenty of cruel things out of pure spite. Yet despite this, her unique worldview may just prove essential to the story's end. While I've gone on about the structure of the tower, and about why it could possibly be justified from a certain perspective, there is a major philosophical theme that can be applied to Tower of God's narrative, which is the idea of determinism. Determinism is an idea which essentially states that humans do not truly possess free will, and that all their future actions can be determined through a combination of environment and genes. This idea has its merit in a number of different scientific and philosophical frames, which I won't get into too much for the purposes of time, but know that it is a very contentious topic with lots of material written on the subject. An older version of determinism states instead that God simply lays out each person's destiny when they are born, which is followed by some smaller sects of Judeo-Christian religions, but isn't so common in modern times. While both versions of determinism have wildly different premises, The main parallel between them is that all future actions could possibly be predicted by someone with absolutely perfect knowledge of the present, be it God or some other hypothetical observer. On this topic, Tower of God chooses to eschew subtlety and quite literally turns destiny into an actual tangible phenomenon. For example, there are guides who can identify paths, which is basically the universe telling them what needs to happen in order to accomplish something. There is Kel Hellam, who can literally see destiny and act around that destiny, and there is Jihad, who can do the same thing but with a higher priority as far as discrepancies are concerned. And then there are irregulars, who supposedly are able to act in defiance of that destiny, although generally speaking cannot see it. Essentially, someone with the ability to see destiny in the tower can predict what others are going to do. If someone's future actions can be predicted, then in a sense it is as though they have no choice to begin with. They are headed down a particular course one way or another, since only someone who can see their destiny has the ability to change it. Thus, we can conclude that most inhabitants of the tower do not possess free will. The choices they make are set in stone unless altered by someone who can. Thus, we are left with two scenarios. It could be that only irregulars have free will and are able to reshape the future inside the tower. Or it could be that even irregulars have no free will, and that only God has the full vision of the destiny of the tower, not even Jihad. Either this entire story from beginning to end will play out exactly as is destined, or someone will defy destiny and achieve an ending that God himself does not want, which in this case might be the good ending. Why do I say this as though God is the bad guy? Well, look at the tower he created. All the tower's suffering and death exists by his design. If the goal of the main characters is to break free of this paradigm, then it would stand to reason that God himself will be their opposition. Now, if you believe that God defines morality, then I guess God, by definition, couldn't be the bad guy. But look at it from the perspective of the characters we are attached to, such as Baum, Kuhn, Wagnon, etc. The attempt to defy destiny has been a theme explored fairly frequently throughout the series, all the way from Season 1, with Ho being driven to madness by his frustration about his lack of talent, or the Hell Train with Daniel wasting his life away obsessing over Rowan, or Hell Joe's arc, along with plenty of other examples that all hinge on people desperately trying and almost always failing to reject the fate they are bound for. That's not to say that everyone's arcs will always end badly, just that a huge source of despair within the tower comes from the inevitability of destiny. Such a strong recurring theme could be tightly linked to the outcome of the story. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the conclusion for the characters might just hinge on their ability, or lack thereof, to break the mold literally set in place by God himself. So, if we assume that changing destiny to a better outcome is the end goal, which is my personal prediction fueled only by the themes I see present in the story, then it would follow that all will hinge on the actions of an irregular. And who is the only irregular in the entire story who seems to be aware of and actively trying to oppose their lot in life? That's right, Rachel. Baum, just by acting in his own interests, happens to be playing right into what everyone else wants from him. Fug is happy that he's fighting Jihad. Jihad sees their conflict as his next adventure. Baum is surrounded by friends whose ambitions eclipse their own ability, and so are largely putting their hopes in Baum to make things better for them. Despite acting as he pleases, he just happens to be obediently following along the path set for him as a matter of course. If you still aren't convinced, remember that Enryu, a messenger of God, briefly entered the tower and conveniently left behind the only weapon that could kill Jihad, 2/3 of which is now possessed by Baum. Worse yet, he isn't even aware of his own complacency in the story, which causes him to move along the path that is expected of him by default. Other irregulars have also settled down and fallen into place. Jihad and Urek both seem to just be going along with the flow for the time being, and Phantominium is missing, although I'm sure he'll pop up at some point or another. Rachel, on the other hand, has her sights set higher. She is fundamentally opposed to the way of life of the tower. Yes, she schemes and murders and betrays, but this is because she acknowledges that as someone who is weak, she only has one way to achieve her ambitions, and it might be no overstatement to say that those ambitions could be greater than anyone else's in the entire tower. In a world where the weak are trampled by the strong, if an irregular capable of defying this way of life was actually able to perceive it for what it is, they might be able to actually break free of the puppet strings and act outside what they are supposed to do. Rachel may just end up being the only one in that position, because she's the only one who is likely to take a step back and understand that she, weak as she is, needs the fundamental order of the tower to change in order to prosper. And because the natural state of the tower was defined by God and exists in an equilibrium involving senseless death and violence because of its inherent design, she will need to defy God in order to make that happen. And this defiance of God could end up being what saves everyone else in the process. Now, am I saying that I am confident in this prediction about Rachel and Baum? Of course not. None of this is directly mentioned in the story, so I have almost no narrative basis for these claims. But I do believe that SIU has a strong thematic message that is steadily building up over time. And for some character arcs to be complete, they will have to confront these tough philosophical questions about destiny and morality in one way or another. So consider this more of a hypothetical thought experiment than anything, an exploration into what SIU might have planned for the broad strokes of the story going forward. And even if you totally disagree, maybe I got you to explore the story in a new light and provided some food for thought. Until next time, goodbye.